What do you do when life just doesn't make sense? Illness strikes, a job is lost, a friendship fades, uncertainty looms. Whether it's a gray-haired saint facing cancer, or a college student burdened by the pressures of the future, or anyone watching the inhumanity of war on the evening news, suffering and uncertainty have a way of shaking us to our very core. Every human being, whether they consider themselves religious or not, wants life to make sense. We all want a world where good things happen to good people, where lives are spared from the ravages of random diseases, and all people are protected from evil. And yet, we know this world doesn't work that way. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes death comes prematurely, snuffing out the beautiful possibilities of a young life. Children go hungry, and political refugees have nowhere to lay their heads. The world is not how we think it should be. And so we struggle to cope with the vicissitudes of the human condition, the unpredicted ups and downs that knock us off balance and make us shake our fists in the air. This isn't fair. Psychologists tell us that trauma or anxiety or grief can cause a dissonance so deep within us that, if not resolved, can grow louder and louder until finally our brains shut down in order to protect us from emotional overload. The science of it tells us that for the soul to flourish, we need to believe that good overcomes evil, that fair play is rewarded, that justice prevails, that ultimately love wins. To live without such hope can be deadly. And while modern science expresses this as a need, ancient scripture presents it as a promise. In the Old Testament book of Ecclesiastes, the author, identified simply as the preacher, writes of this dissonance, of the ebb and flow of life and the vacillation of blessing and calamity and peril and promise. This is a familiar passage to many of us. We can all recite the opening line, "For everything there is a season, and a time for every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die." For some, this passage seems a bit fatalistic. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you die. And you might consider that conclusion if you don't read far enough into this passage. Most of the time when we read this, we read through maybe the first 8 verses of this chapter, where we're given the back and forth of peril and promise, of peace and war. And we don't actually get to what the preacher brings to us as the conclusion. And so this morning, we're going to read just the first 4 verses of this passage to remind us ourselves of how the preacher describes the nature of this life. And then we're going to jump to his conclusion, to verse 11, which we most often don't hear in this context. And hopefully it will put it all into perspective. So would you read this with me? For everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to cry and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance. Yet God has made everything beautiful in its own time and has planted eternity in the human heart. Yet God has made everything beautiful in its own time and has planted eternity in the human heart. Now, I know right about now some of you are saying, okay, Jay, we've indulged you for 5 minutes now, and you've been taking us down this road of yin and yang, and the service is going to run long. Do we need to remind you that it's the third Sunday of Advent and Christmas is just a week away? No, I get it. What I'm suggesting is that though we rarely see it this way, this passage from Ecclesiastes is actually an Advent passage. Even more than that, I would suggest that this passage contains within itself the very definition of Advent. In popular culture, we see Advent as a time to prepare for Christmas, to make our lists, to count down the days, to decorate the house, to wrap presents and bake cookies. But we all know that Advent is more than that. Advent is a time to look back at what God has done in Jesus and a time to look forward to what God is yet to do. It's a time to remember the deep spiritual longing that the people of Israel had as they waited for the Messiah. It's a time to remember how they needed God to make sense out of their lives, how they needed a promise of justice, how they longed for good to overcome evil and for love to win. Advent is a time of yearning that stretches from the past to the present and into the future. It's a time for us to recognize that God is still at work in this world, bringing about the promise that love wins. Advent is a longing and a promise. And that's what we have in this passage from Ecclesiastes. Through poetry that still breathes after thousands of years, and whose beauty is undimmed despite countless translations, the preacher recounts our predicament, expresses our longing for life to make sense in our times of tears and grief and war. In this passage, the preacher expresses the longing of Advent and also claims the promise. God will make all things beautiful in its time. And how do we know that, the preacher says? Because God has planted eternity in the human heart. In other words, life only makes sense in light of eternity. The dissonance of life can only be resolved when heaven touches earth. This passage from Ecclesiastes is telling us that God has placed an eternal longing in the human heart, that within every human soul is a God-given awareness that there is something more than the chaos of this transient world. Think of it this way. As people of faith, we acknowledge that we are created by God to love and to be loved by God. If God is the reason we exist, then it follows that our existence only makes sense in light of God. Without eternity at the center of our thinking, our picture of life is like a jigsaw puzzle, missing its central piece. We were created for it, and God has placed an awareness of it in our hearts. Without it, we might as well say, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Now, when we talk about eternity, we're not talking about a spot on some cosmic timeline. Excuse me. We're talking about the completion of God's promises. We're talking about a world where suffering and sin are no more, where love will be the only law, and where we will live in perfect peace with God and with one another forever and ever. It's the promise of eternity, the promise of the completion of God's craftsmanship. That's what fills us with hope. Because we know that this world is not all there is. We know that sin, trials, and suffering will not last forever. And that's why Advent and Christmas are central to who we are as Christians. In a world restless and dark with the realities of fear, hunger, war, and oppression, God came into this world to bring eternity to us. In Jesus, God came to us to satisfy the longings of our hearts. In Jesus, God became one of us. In Jesus, heaven touched earth. The eternal broke in to the temporary. As Ecclesiastes tells us, we are created in such a way that we long for this heavenly touch. Over my years as a pastor, and I suppose I should say, based on how it's been referred to already a couple times this morning, my many years as a pastor, I've spent quite a bit of time contemplating Christmas, particularly why Christmas has such a universal appeal. Of course, there's the attraction of a newborn baby. Who doesn't love a baby? But why does the world stop because of this baby? What is it about this baby that can make wars cease? Why on Christmas Eve, more than any other night, do we turn our face to the starlit sky, looking for peace to wash over us? It's because God has planted eternity in our hearts, and we long to feel the touch of heaven on earth. I can testify to this in my own life. Most of you have heard me say that I didn't grow up in a religious household. Mom would send us to vacation Bible school because it was free daycare. My first memory of attending Sunday school was when I was in third grade. Until then, most of what I knew about God, and particularly about Christmas, came through Charlie Brown's Christmas special. But when I was in third grade, my oldest sister had a baby, and her husband went to Vietnam. So having no place to live, my sister and the baby came back home to live with us. It displaced us all in one way or another. The bedrooms were already full. There were no spare beds, so Sue and the baby moved into the living room. Sue slept on the couch, and the baby slept in a bassinet pushed against the wall, and baby clothes and blankets were stacked on the television. That was about the same time Mom started sending us to Sunday school. I was too young to make the connection at the time, but looking back at it, I can see how Mom, having a 17-year-old daughter, bringing a baby into our house, made my mom review some of her life choices, particularly the religious upbringing of her children. By the time Christmas rolled around that year, I was in fourth grade by then, the story of a teenage mother with no place to live took on a new meaning. And that was the year that Jesus replaced Santa as the center of Christmas for me. The season began normally. The day after Thanksgiving, the decorations came out, the Christmas records among them. The house began to be adorned in a variety of ways, and a few Christmas presents started appearing. But as the days went by, I started to get uneasy. I was afraid that we would go through Christmas and have a good time, but that Jesus would be forgotten. And for the first time, that bothered me. So I decided that while everyone else in the world may forget about Jesus at Christmas, I wouldn't. So while my brothers and sisters were writing letters to Santa, I decided that I would write a letter to Jesus and pray it on Christmas Eve at midnight. So I stole a piece of paper from a yellow spiral notebook of my older brother's, and I began writing. Now, this was just between me and Jesus. It was a secret. And it was going to take some thought. I wanted to make sure that it was special. So I had to find a hiding place to keep it while I worked on it over the coming days. And I thought I had the perfect hiding place. I hid it in an old Beatles album. Some of you know album, the big vinyl inside. I hid it inside the album cover, and I would take it out and work on it whenever I could. It started, "Dear Jesus." And that's as far as I got for several days. It needed to be perfect, and I wasn't going to hurry it. It eventually became 2 whole pages, even as I continued to work on it. But one day, my older brother decided he wanted to hear something besides Christmas music, and he pulled out the old Beatles album. And when he did, he found my letter and began to tease me. But to my surprise, I wasn't embarrassed or ashamed. I knew this was something right for me to do. So when Christmas Eve rolled around, I was ready. Us kids, of course, had to go to bed early. But I was determined to stay awake until the moment of Jesus' birth. And so, at what I imagined to be midnight, I pulled out my letter and prayed it to Jesus. I didn't want Jesus to feel left out. And in that moment, for me, I knew heaven had touched earth. I knew the presence and friendship of Jesus. And that was the best gift I could have. And I cried. I'm not sure why. It might have been joy. It might have been a sense of unworthiness. It might have been sadness because others didn't seem to have this same joy. But I knew that the Jesus of history was the Jesus in my heart. And that Christmas was the answer to my deepest longings. And I fell asleep that night, singing to myself, "Joy to the world, the Lord has come, let earth receive her King." Because God had planted eternity in the human heart. A barely churched 10-year-old little boy reached to Jesus on Christmas Eve and found Jesus reaching back. Today, I still experience Advent as a time of longing and promise. Today I long for the earth to be bathed in righteousness. Today I long for peace to be coupled with justice. Today I long for all people to know Jesus as their friend and Savior. And I hold on to that promise that God makes all things beautiful in its time. So what do you long for today? Where do you feel the dissonance between what is and what should be? What do you do when life doesn't make sense? Because God has planted eternity in our hearts, we long to feel the touch of heaven on earth. So today, I invite you to claim the hope of Advent, to let eternity sprout in your heart, and to know the promise that God is at work, making all things beautiful.